when it came to the country and Western movies, the Indigenous people were always the bad guys. They always died in the end.
I remember, the cowboy movies, and my brother would want to play cowboys and Indians. I would be like, I would cry, and because he would want to be the cowboy and he would want me to be the Indian, and I'd be like, I don't want to be the Indian. And he was like, why? Because they always get killed.
Spent my summer in a van, St. Augustine to Michigan. Held my breath, said a prayer. All those people waiting there. I've been searching so long. It lived in me all along.
My name is Caroline Cochrane.
So my name is Leslie Logan.
The daughter of Stan Cochrane, whose family comes from Ontario, the second family immigrants, and the daughter of Shirley Rankin Wanish, family comes from Paddle Prairie, which is a Métis settlement just under the border in northern Alberta.
Member of the Seneca Nation of Indians. I'm a member of the Deer Clan. I grew up on the Tonawanda Indian Reservation, which are two separate and distinct communities of Seneca people. So my father was Tonawanda Band of Seneca. My mother is Seneca Nation and rolled from Cattaraugus. And so, as you may know, the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee people of the Six Nations follow by a matrilineal descent. So your nationhood comes from, or citizenry, whatever you want to call it, comes from your mother. So my mother is Cattaraugus.
I identify as me. I kind of like me, so I'll use me. I identify with groups. I identify with many groups. I'm a woman. I'm an Indigenous woman. I'm a Northerner. I'm an older woman. I'm a mother. I'm a grandmother. I mean, there's many, many groups that I identify with.
I have been on the Cattaraugus territory for the last 14 years and am now in Ithaca, here at Cornell, as the Associate Director of the American Indian Indigenous Studies program. I was formerly in the regulatory arm of our gaming corporation, but most recently was doing a lot of grassroots organization and advocacy within my community, and was a founding member of the Seneca Mothers of the Nation. Really sort of kind of pulling back and establishing women's voices and leadership in the community, use that sort of as a jumping off point to also establish a youth engagement initiative.
My background is social work. I've had a degree in social work for over almost 25 years now. Chose that field because coming from a hard background as a youth and being a street child at 13, I hit the road, and when I had my second child, I realized that I needed to do better so that my children could do better. So I made different choices and worked in the NGO world with homeless women and low-income families for many years until I came to run for politics and became a minister and then became the premier of the Northwest Territories. So that's a little bit who I am.
Of the American dream, and
you think of your ancestors and great-great-grandmothers, and that they had to flee with babies, and that they had to flee on foot, and that they didn't know where they were going, and that they had no homes or no shelter, no people that were taking them in. That genocide, and it wasn't just a phenomena that was the sole experience of the Seneca people. It was all Native people who fled. And I tend to kind of want to shy away from using the word displaced. Two writers from the Cornell Sun wrote an article, and it was on the front page of the Cornell Sun, so the placement was good. But in the headline and in the body of the article, they refused to use the word dispossession and use the kind of softer word displaced, that we were displaced, that tribes were displaced. 240 tribes were displaced.
So back in the days when Indigenous people were under the Indian Act and still under the Indian Act, they were called Indians. And the terminology changed throughout the years. They were Aboriginal, and then we became Indigenous. I always kind of find it funny when people scramble over what to name people, that people just pick up these new names.
In communities, what you find is probably that there's just more an on-the-ground generational experience, right? So particularly for those people who haven't been, don't have a post-secondary education, that there's probably more of a tendency and comfortability in using terms like Indian. Where I come from, I grew up out in Tonawanda, which is a very, very small community. The people don't say Indian, they say it with like a little bit of a bent, right? It's Indian, we're Indians. And among my peers growing up, and even today, you would refer to other natives as skins, not as in red skins, but as in same skin. So it's almost like one of those, the phenomena of where you've taken ownership of a term, but have recontextualized it on your own terms. I think that the interpretation and how other people perceive and utilize those terms and adopt those as well has expanded.
People are starting to reclaim words that have been seen as derogatory in society, so that's to try to change the perception of how society sees those terms. So I think it's important to not jump on that if you're not Indigenous, in honesty, but allow that people that come from different cultures or backgrounds actually have the right to reclaim and use the terminology that they want to be defined as.
As far as the academy goes, I think there's more of I hate to say almost like an over-analysis. So your everyday average normal person from the territory is going to be like, yeah, I'm skin, yeah, I'm Indian. But if you're talking about people in the academy, oh, well, no, we're Indigenous, or no, we're First Nations, or no, we're, But I think ultimately most people are going to tell you that they would prefer to be known by the communities from which they come very specifically. So who am I? I'm Seneca. But there are also, some jockeying about what you can and cannot use. So for instance, many people, if you're not an actual enrolled member, some people feel very critical about if you're a descendant, can you use that term for yourself?
So I think that the real key, though, is that not making the assumption that everyone identifies the same. Some people identify as Indigenous here. Some people identify as Aboriginal. Some people identify as Northerners. Some identify as Métis. Some identify as Slavies, Inuvialuit, Inuit. So it's really important that we don't think that one label addresses everyone. The more respectful thing is when you enter into communities or areas is that you ask the people.
Let's get on the road now. The snow is coming in and it won't be plowed until morning. Let's drive.
I think it has a huge impact on how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive people. I'm 61, so I'm of a generation that when I was young, never had TV in the North. It wasn't here. It wasn't just that we were poor, it just wasn't here. And I do remember when the first TVs came into the Northwest Territories, and after a while, my father got one for the family, and it was black and white, and this great big huge thing, but it was so exciting. And then we started to watch TV, and it was a Sunday event. Usually Sundays we would sit together as a family and all watch things like Disney World and Western shows. Always perceived as Disneyland, everything is perfect. Usually non-Indigenous people portrayed in their movies, and everything always turned out in the end. Everything turned out okay for the people that were non-Indigenous. When I started reading newspapers and watching the news on TV, in honesty, I thought that the media was honest, it was unbiased, and that everything I seen was true. In fact, it was more true than the Bible. I questioned the Bible philosophy more than I questioned the media, because they knew, somehow they knew. So since I've been in politics, I've learned that is not necessarily true. I've learned that bad news sells, and every industry, including media, has to have an income. And so if you're not getting any ratings, or if you're not selling any papers or whatever, just on good news stories, then you're going to really focus on the bad. And I do think that media in general has really started to focus on the bad, which also impacts the general society. Because if the media is what we're watching all the time and reading all the time, it's where we're getting a form of education, and it's always negative, then what does that do to you as a person?
I'm closing in on 60, so I've seen kind of a longer range of media, and communities on the ground. Again, the responses are different than you would see, let's say, in academia. And at the time, I remember just feeling like, wow, Disney actually has a character. It's about Native students, and we've got a Pocahontas. But I remember when I was in just graduating from high school and went to college, I was always called Pocahontas, right? It's just pervasive. And so, to see a character out there that had at least graduated from Peter Pan, right, which was just really horrible. And it's almost like you have to, if you're going to let your kids watch it, well, then you have to explain and just provide this whole, like a discourse on it. And now today, I think that that's the case with, Pocahontas, and just going back and, okay, well, the story that we're always going to tell, that we're always going to see, is that one, and it just misrepresents us in such a sometimes in a harmful way. So I think that it's graduated and then it's evolved from one just having an appreciation that you're seeing any image at all, to being a little more reflective and providing some more deeper analysis on that.
Well, I was older when Pocahontas came out, actually. My children were watching TV and at that time. I will say that Pocahontas, the way it was portrayed, is a beautiful woman. I'm going to start with that. And when I first seen it, that's what I thought. What a beautiful woman. And so I have to go back to what was the intent of Disney when they did that movie. Was the intent to show that Indigenous people were bad in communities, but one person, this beautiful woman, could go forward? Or you could almost look at every single movie that is made and ask almost the same question. Is that really how criminals think? Is that really how that society thinks? Is that really how couples are? Maybe those are questions we need to be asking. They probably are. But again, the perception of Pocahontas and that this is how all Indigenous people are is not true. It is a fantasy.
What do we do when the people are under attack? Stand up, fight back. What do we do when the water is under attack? Stand up, fight back. What do we do when the earth is under attack? Stand up, fight back.
Chris Eyre is a friend. And so when he came out with Smoke Signals, he came out to Tonawanda because he was looking for some trailers. And so he met my grandmother. The mother, when she makes the fry bread and they don't have enough and they break it up, which is also really funny because that's actually happened to us in real life. But her name was Arlene. And he wrote it, and that was my grandmother's name. So he kind of worked her into the story. But that was a big deal. That was a really big deal, to see more contemporary images and stories being told about your communities. And we were just so gratified and proud. Media in that respect, was very influential, and just being able to kind of convey that on down, to my kids, and feeling like that was kind of when the doors started to open. So it was really very influential, because before that, you didn't see many contemporary images or stories being told. That was really kind of, a seminal effort.
I think that more and more the media, especially in the North, are focusing on more cultural practices. In fact, we have a radio station that is in Indigenous languages. We have a TV channel that actually reports by Indigenous people on community matters. It's interesting. When I used to run the homeless shelter before the women's shelter, that like in the afternoon when the radio came on and they were speaking Indigenous language, you never seen so many women congregate in the kitchen. And then when it was over, they'd all disappear on the streets. So, but it showed how connected and how important the media was to them, because a lot of the women at the shelter were not from Yellowknife. Yellowknife had the only shelter, but they were from the communities. And so having the opportunity to hear, the radio in their own language was so critical for them in their own identity and retaining their own culture. So
nowadays we've got so much going on, and just the phenomena of reservation dogs and whatnot. But yeah, it absolutely has played a part. There have been some documentaries in our community. We have a couple of documentary filmmakers who have put out a number of pieces that have talked about Kinzua Dam and the relocation that occurred to our community. That was huge and remains very integral, important piece in our community. So really, really important.
I would say the same thing to all students, whatever field they are, because my background is social work and my degree is in social work, and so it's the same thing. I think in all is check where you come from, check your own belief systems. Is that the real story, or is that your own personal bias? Think about what what do you want to leave as your legacy?
So you have to be careful about, as a consumer, about what you're reading, because the whole story may not be there, and you have to be careful and always questioning, where is this perspective actually coming from?
You have to be comfortable and you have to challenge yourself. I do think that the media have a huge influence, and I think that if they're not careful, that they can actually influence how people think of others and themselves, and they can also almost be a part in the destiny of the future of humankind. The thing I'd like to give to your professors is be easy on the students, because it's tough being a student out there. I remember those days.